Last time you were on, we discussed the China trade deal, of course, and did discuss the balance of power in negotiations between Robert Lighthizer and the president. You said that if Robert Lighthizer had all the cards and the power, that a deal was harder. Where do you stand on the belief of who's leading the negotiation and where we're going to end up now?
Well, there's no question that Robert Lighthizer is leading the negotiation in the sense that he's the man with the command of the detail. But we saw just the other day that the president has the power to overrule him even in the terminology of the deal. He was on TV explaining why he doesn't like the phrase memorandum of understanding, and Robert Lighthizer very quickly had to drop that phrase and get on with Trumpian language like trade deal. So I think the big question, and I'm here in Washington thinking a lot about this, is whether or not President Trump is going to overrule Robert Lighthizer and take a deal that Lighthizer would regard as inadequate, as weak. And I very much hope he doesn't do that, because I think Robert Lighthizer has been doing an excellent job driving a very hard bargain. And when Lighthizer says we're not there yet, I take that very seriously.
And to that point, Neil, it seems to me the key element in all of this is going to be enforcement and what that mechanism looks like. And thus, that whole process is going to take time as well, because even if you do get some sort of short-term deal right now and a decision to not increase tariffs, to be able to see China actually carry out what it agrees to, which it hasn't done in the past, despite other, plans to the contrary, that's still, you're looking at a timeline that could stretch into years, right?
Well, this is not going to be over at Mar-a-Lago if indeed President Trump meets Xi Jinping there in the coming weeks, because ultimately it's about much more than just the trade deficit now. If you think back, say, a year when all of this was kicking off, the Chinese assumed that if they just could figure out a way of reducing the bilateral trade deficit, then President Trump would be happy and it would all be over very quickly. It took them a while to realize that Mr. Trump was in earnest and that Robert Lighthizer was in very deep earnest about getting the Chinese to do much more, in particular about going after their Made in China 2025 program, which is essentially a program using all means, fair and foul, to get China as far up the value chain in terms of technological sophistication as possible. So this is a big, complicated issue, and I don't expect the trade war to become a trade peace via a tweet or indeed a dinner between two presidents. The other thing I'd add, which is really significant here, is that in the course of the last year, the trade war has become about much more than just trade. It's in fact a tech war that is also going on now as the United States Congress goes after China in a number of different ways, potentially limiting exports of very sophisticated chips from the US to China, and also limiting Chinese investment into US tech companies. I think the tech war is much more important ultimately than the trade war. You could say the trade war with tariffs and negotiations is a sort of 1970s throwback, the kind of thing that happened in the Nixon-Ford years. But the tech war, that is a 21st century story about competition in 5G, competition in artificial intelligence, and even quantum computing. That is not going to be over anytime soon. In fact, it could define the new Cold War of our time.
Neil, is the North Korea issue linked to the China trade? I mean, we're sort of reporting them as separate stories today, but is any progress with North Korea possible without a China trade deal? And if so, which should the president really be focusing his efforts on more? Which matters more to the US?
When you ask diplomats on either side this question, they tend to say there's no linkage. But I have a sense that the president sees there as being some linkage. It's been his assumption from the outset that China would be the power that could put pressure on North Korea to shift its position on its nuclear arms program. I think that's a vain hope. In the sense that it's not obvious to me that doing any kind of deal with China is greatly going to increase the president's leverage with Kim Jong-un. I mean, that leverage was pretty weak to begin with, and it must be said that since his first summit with Kim Jong-un, he's only given the North Korean dictator an easier time in return for not very much. So I'd rather there was no linkage. In my view, what President Trump did with North Korea was to make too easy a deal too quickly without teeth, without enforcement. I really hope he's not going to do the same thing with China, and I hope that Robert Lighthizer, in that sense, gets his way.
Neil, all eyes are on Vietnam right now with this summit and these, denuclearization talks and what that definition could look like. But meantime, you've seen this really fast and quite frankly alarming ratcheting up of tensions between two other nuclear countries in the last couple of days as well, India and Pakistan. Should investors be watching that more closely? And is this something that could actually really truly spill over into a full-fledged conflict?
That's funny. I thought all eyes were on Michael Cohen rather than on Hanoi, but you're quite right to raise the question of whether we should be more worried.
Eyes have been in a lot of places today, I think.
A good question is whether we should be more worried than markets appear to be about the fact that India and China are engaged in military hostilities with at least one fighter plane shot down by the Pakistanis. I doubt very much that this is going to escalate into full-blown war. Of course, if it did, that would be extremely alarming since these are nuclear powers. But I've seen this kind of thing before. It's really all about Kashmir from the point of view of the Pakistanis, and I suspect from the point of view of the Indians, it's all about Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi's prospects of re-election, which at the moment don't look too bright. So I think it's understandable that markets are not getting too panicked. I think the general expectation is that this is a little local difficulty and it will not escalate into something bigger.
Neil, I want to ask you quickly about Brexit. Prime Minister Theresa May has promised various Remainers that she will offer a vote to allow them to delay Brexit if no deal as an eventuality is looking more likely. Do you think no deal is off the table now?
It does look that way. I mean, it's of course become the longest running political soap opera in the world. But my sense is that the probability of a no deal outcome at the end of March and a really major economic shock to the UK, that probability is down in the single digits now. And the most likely outcome, I think, is that she's going to have one more attempt with her withdrawal agreement, and I suspect will fail. And one reason she'll fail is precisely that the no-deal danger has been reduced, and that just reduces the incentive to vote for her withdrawal agreement. My fear is that what we're going to end up with is a postponement, an extension, some further months are going to pass, but at the end of it all, Britain's going to be in the same situation with deep divisions on both parties about what exactly Brexit means. So unfortunately, I can hear the distant sound of a can being kicked down the road. Kind of familiar in European politics, isn't it?